The sun had just begun to warm the streets of Ashbridge, North Carolina, a town stitched together by front porch flags, old oak trees, and a kind of silence that clung to the sidewalks like mist. On that particular Thursday morning, the quiet was only broken by the distant hum of lawnmowers and the gentle creak of shopkeepers unlocking doors. It was a place where not much changed. For some, that sameness was a comfort. For others, it was a burden they carried quietly. Elijah Monroe stepped off the local transit bus at 9:17 a.m., his movements slow but purposeful. At 85 years old, he walked with a steady limp. His left knee never fully recovered from the bitter winter of 1952, when he had slid down a frozen hill under enemy fire near the banks of the Imjin River. His khaki pants were freshly pressed, his boots polished with care. Draped over his shoulders was a weather-worn military-issue field jacket, its edges frayed, its patches faded but unmistakable. U.S. Army, 2nd Infantry Division. A small row of ribbons sat on his chest, silent, shining reminders of places he never forgot. Elijah had come to Ashbridge by invitation. Ms. Carter, a young history teacher at the local high school, had heard him speak at a veterans hospital in Charlotte 2 months prior. Moved by the gravity of his words, stories of war, brotherhood, and the invisible battles Black veterans faced when they came home, she'd invited him to share his experience with her students during their unit on the Korean War. Elijah had agreed without hesitation. He was early, 40 minutes early to be precise. And so, with time to spare, he walked the town square. He admired the courthouse's marble columns, paused beneath a sycamore tree whose roots cracked the sidewalk like nature reminding man who came first. He listened to birdsong, the kind that sounded unchanged by decades. And yet, there was a weight in the air that didn't come from age or humidity. The stairs began subtly. A woman walking her dog slowed to a near halt as she passed. A man sipping coffee on a bench tilted his sunglasses down, watching Elijah's every step. A teenage boy across the street elbowed his friend and whispered something. Elijah had seen it all before, in Georgia, in Texas, in Missouri. Places where a Black man in a uniform was always too visible, too questioned, too out of place. He kept walking, one hand gripping the strap of his duffel bag, the other adjusting his cap. There was no threat in his stride, no confrontation in his eyes, only a history written in silence, a history few ever asked him about. "Excuse me, sir." The voice came from behind him, firm but not yet hostile. Elijah turned slowly. 2 officers approached. The taller one, Officer Higgins, stood with his thumbs hooked into his belt, legs spread just wider than necessary. Behind him, Officer Brown, much younger, hovered uncertainly. "We got a call about someone acting suspicious," Higgins said, his gaze locked on the patches on Elijah's jacket. "Wearing military gear, loitering around the square. Can we see some ID?" Elijah blinked once. Suspicious. He didn't raise his voice, didn't scoff. He reached into the inner pocket of his jacket and carefully handed over his ID. "My name is Elijah Monroe," he said calmly. "I'm here to speak at Ashbridge High. You can check with Ms. Carter. I'm a guest today." Higgins took the ID, examining it longer than necessary, while Brown glanced between the 2 men with visible unease. There was a moment of silence, thick, stretching. A 3rd patrol car pulled up. Officer Reyes stepped out, adjusting his belt with an air of readiness that made Elijah's stomach twist. Reyes said nothing at first. He just eyed Elijah's bag, his jacket, and his skin. Then he muttered something about trespassing and unverified presence. Elijah took a breath. It was the kind of breath he'd learned to take in Korea, when the air crackled with something unseen but undeniable. The kind of breath that came right before a line was crossed. He glanced around. A few bystanders had stopped walking. Some lifted phones. "I'm not here to cause trouble," Elijah said softly. "I fought for this country. I bled for it. I have a letter of invitation in my bag. But it didn't matter, not yet, because sometimes when a black man wears a uniform and walks with pride, the world forgets everything else and only sees a question it wants to answer in handcuffs. And that was how it began. Not with shouting, not with resistance, just with a walk, in a silence that finally cracked. Inside the Ashbridge Police Department, the fluorescent lights buzzed faintly overhead. The reception area was modest, two plastic chairs, a chip counter, and the hum of a vending machine that hadn't been serviced in weeks. The kind of place that made discomfort feel routine. Elijah Monroe sat in a small interrogation room at the back of the station. His wrists were still bound with cold steel, biting into his skin each time he shifted in the uncomfortable metal chair. The room had no windows, no clock. Only the sound of his breathing, measured and deliberate, echoed against the cinder block walls. He had been in tighter spots than this. He had once waited 3 days pinned in a frozen trench at the base of Hill 266, with mortar fire overhead and no sure promise of air support. Back then, he'd relied on stillness to survive. Still hands, still breath, a still mind. But this was a different kind of cold. He could hear them talking outside the door. Higgins, Reyes, and the younger one, Brown. Their voices rose and fell just beyond the cracked opening. He couldn't make out every word, but he caught fragments. Has to be up to something. We'll call the chief if we have to. AWOL at his age? Elijah stared at the table in front of him. On its surface were faint scratches, initials carved by others who had sat in the same room. He wondered how many had been here because of a misunderstanding. How many had walked in free and left marked. He looked down at his cuffed hands, skin wrinkled and dark, veins visible, a lifetime of labor mapped across his knuckles. On his right pinky was a ring, simple, silver, etched with the emblem of the 2nd Infantry Division. A gift from his commanding officer the day their platoon had survived what the Army would later call a strategically impossible extraction. He flexed his fingers slowly. Pain sparked up his wrists. The door creaked. Officer Brown stepped in, holding a file folder. His face was pale, his eyes unsure. "Mr. Monroe," he said, avoiding eye contact, "we're still trying to verify your status." Elijah raised his eyes. "I gave you my ID. I told you why I was here." Brown shifted uncomfortably. "We're just being thorough." Elijah's voice stayed even. "Son, I've seen through. It looked like digging latrines at 2 in the morning in -10 degrees. This is something else." Brown paused, then left the room without another word. Moments later, Officer Reyes returned, this time more aggressive. He placed Elijah's duffel bag on the table, unzipped it roughly, and began rifling through the contents. Inside were neatly folded clothes, a leather-bound folder of commendation letters, and a carefully wrapped velvet box. Reyes opened the box and stared. Inside were Elijah's campaign medals, National Defense, Korean Service, Bronze Star, and a Purple Heart with a faded photograph tucked beside them. A young Elijah standing shoulder to shoulder with his squad, rifles slung across their backs, snow covering the ground beneath them. Reyes narrowed his eyes. "Where'd you get these, Barry?" Elijah's mouth tightened. "They're mine. You could have bought him online." "I didn't." Reyes said nothing. He slammed the box shut and walked out. Alone again, Elijah exhaled and closed his eyes. He began whispering the names of the men in that photo: Lewis, Booker, Tanaka, O'Brien, Green. Every one of them is gone now. Not from the war, but from time. From a country that remembered their service once a year and forgot them the other 364 days. The minutes dragged on. His back ached from the stiff chair. The pressure around his wrists had turned from dull to sharp. Still, he stayed composed. A soldier knows when to wait. Then something changed. Outside the room, there was a new commotion. Quick footsteps, raised voices, a woman's tone, sharp, commanding. Elijah lifted his head, then a name cut through the air like a blade. FBI. His heart didn't race. He had suspected it might come to this, even hoped for it. Before the bus pulled into Ashbridge, he had left a message with someone he trusted, Colonel Marcus Eldridge, now a high-ranking Pentagon advisor. Eldridge had once told him, "If you ever find yourself in a fight you can't talk your way out of, let me do the talking." Marcus had picked up the phone. The door swung open. Two figures entered, one tall and composed, the other compact with intense eyes. "Mr. Elijah Monroe?" the woman asked. Her voice was level, firm. "I'm Agent Ramirez. This is Agent Dalton. We're here on behalf of the U.S. Department of Justice." Elijah met her gaze. "You're a welcome sight." Ramirez's eyes moved to the handcuffs. "What the hell is this?" she snapped, spinning around. "Officer, remove these immediately." Higgins had appeared behind them, holding a manila folder, his face reddening. "This is a local matter. We haven't filed charges." "It stopped being local the moment you illegally detained a decorated war veteran with no probable cause," Ramirez shot back. "Now take those off, now!" Reyes appeared beside Higgins, looking ready to argue. Dalton stepped between them. "You're out of your depth. If you'd like to read your civil rights manual again, now might be a good time." There was a long pause. Then begrudgingly, Higgins stepped forward and unlocked the cuffs. The metal fell away from Elijah's wrists with a quiet clink. He winced as he rubbed the deep red marks. Ramirez turned to him, her tone softening. "Are you hurt?" "Nothing that won't fade," he said quietly. "Eventually." Dalton glanced around the room. "We'll be clearing your name from every record in this department. You'll leave here as you came, in peace and with dignity. But first we'll make sure you get where you were meant to go." Elijah looked at him steady. "I have a classroom to reach." Ramirez nodded. "Then let's get you there." As they turned to leave, Officer Brown lingered in the corner. His face was pale, his hands shaking slightly. As Elijah passed him, the young man opened his mouth, then closed it again. Elijah stopped for a beat, then said softly, "Next time, son, speak up a little sooner." Brown's eyes filled with regret. He gave a slight, ashamed nod. Elijah walked forward, each step slow but sure. The war he had fought decades ago had taught him how to endure pain, to serve from under fire. But this was about something else. This was about being seen. And for the first time that day, someone finally had. Outside the Ashbridge Police Department, the heat of late morning hung thick in the air. But inside, the air had grown colder, tighter. Word had spread fast. Administrative Assistant Claire, who had watched Elijah Monroe arrive in handcuffs just an hour earlier, now stood frozen behind her desk as two federal agents paced past her without asking for permission. Agent Ramirez led the way, her suit sharp, her steps sharper. Beside her, Agent Dalton carried a thick folder under one arm, his expression unreadable. Claire opened her mouth to speak, but thought better of it. Something about the way they moved said they weren't here for pleasantries. Higgins was the first officer to intercept them in the hallway. He held a clipboard, but the moment he recognized their badges, his posture faltered. "We're handling a routine inquiry," he said quickly. The man's presence raised concerns from residents. Agent Ramirez didn't stop walking. "You arrested an 85-year-old Korean War veteran with no criminal history and valid identification," she said flatly. "You didn't just raise concerns, you raised federal alarms." Reyes appeared at the end of the hall, his jaw clenched tight. "This is our jurisdiction." "No," Dalton said, stepping forward. "This is a civil rights case now. You turned a decorated war hero into a detainee because of a call from someone who felt uncomfortable. And you ignored due process to do it." Officer Brown trailed behind the others, noticeably quiet. His eyes darted from Elijah's face to the agents, then back to the floor. Ramirez noticed him but said nothing, for now. They reached the interrogation room. Elijah looked up as the door opened. He was no longer in handcuffs, but the imprint of them remained on his wrists like a shadow of what had just happened. His eyes met Ramirez's, calm but tired. "Mr. Monroe," she said gently, "are you ready to leave?" Elijah stood slowly. "I've been ready." Agent Dalton extended a hand to steady him, but Elijah waved it off politely. He wanted to walk out under his power. Behind them, Higgins barked, "Wait, we haven't cleared anything. This isn't your—" Ramirez turned on him with precision. "You're right. It's not ours alone. It belongs to the American people. And when the American people hear that a black veteran who served in Korea was handcuffed for walking down the street with a duffel bag and honor on his chest, they'll want answers." She turned to Brown. "Escort Mr. Monroe out." "Now." Brown nodded quickly and stepped forward, opening the door wider. Elijah stepped out into the hallway where other officers had begun to gather. Some curious, some uncomfortable, all silent. None moved to speak. Ramirez turned to Reyes and Higgins one last time. "We'll be submitting a full request to the Department of Justice for a preliminary investigation into your department. Expect to hear from Washington soon." They walked Elijah through the station like a procession. Claire stood at her desk, mouth slightly open, as she saw the man she'd watched being brought in, now escorted out like a guest of honor. At the front door, Claire hesitated. "Should I erase the booking log?" Higgins, humiliated, hissed, "Do it, now." Claire's fingers hovered over the keyboard, but her eyes drifted to Elijah. "Mr. Monroe," she said quietly, "I'm sorry." He gave her a small nod, not in forgiveness but in recognition. "Not your fight," he replied, "but thank you for not looking away." Outside, a black SUV waited at the curb, its engine running. A few reporters had gathered across the street, tipped off by whispers from within the department. Cameras were being raised, voices calling, "Who is he? Why was he detained?" Elijah paused on the steps, scanning the horizon. He thought of all the mornings like this one, back in the winter of '51, watching the sun rise over a frozen ridge in Korea, wondering if he'd make it through another day. And here he was, older, slower, but unbroken. Dalton opened the SUV door. "We'll take you to the school, sir. Miss Carter's still waiting." Elijah nodded. "Let's not keep the kids waiting any longer." And with that, the door closed behind him. The SUV pulled away from the station, the wheels turning not just toward a school auditorium, but towards something larger, toward reckoning, toward justice, toward a moment that wouldn't be forgotten. The SUV pulled into the circular drive of Ashbridge High School just past noon. The American flag outside swayed gently in the breeze, casting its shadow across the well-kept lawn. The front steps were unusually crowded with students lingering near the doors, their eyes flitting toward every approaching car. Rumors had already begun to spread, something about a guest speaker being arrested, about FBI agents showing up at the station. The story was moving faster than anyone expected. Inside the vehicle, Elijah Monroe sat quietly, straightening the collar of his old military jacket. His wrists still bore faint red lines from the handcuffs, and his back ached from the hours of sitting and waiting. But his voice remained steady, unbroken. Agent Ramirez turned to him as the car slowed. "You sure you're up for this?" Elijah gave a slight nod. "They need to hear it, and I need to say it." As the doors opened, Principal Bowers rushed out to meet them, her face tight with concern. She wore a navy pantsuit and held a clipboard close to her chest, as if it could shield her from the weight of the moment. "Mr. Monroe," she began breathlessly, "we've been trying to reach the station all morning. Ms. Carter was beside herself. She insisted on postponing the assembly until you arrived." "I'm sorry for the trouble," Elijah said calmly, stepping onto the concrete. "I had an unexpected delay." Principal Bauer's eyes dropped briefly to his wrists and the faded edge of his jacket, then back to his face. She understood more than she let on. Let me show you the way. Inside the auditorium, the lights had already dimmed. Over 200 students filled the rows, murmuring to one another in hushed voices. On stage, Miss Carter, tall brown-haired, invisibly anxious, paced near the microphone. When Elijah entered through the side curtain, she turned instantly. Relief poured over her face like light through glass. "Mr. Monroe," she whispered, rushing to him. "Are you all right? I heard something happened." "I'll tell them," he said simply. "They should know the whole story." She nodded, then stepped aside. The microphone squealed slightly as Elijah approached it. The students quieted almost immediately. He stood under the spotlight in that old military jacket, his medals tucked into the pocket of his duffel bag, and looked out over the crowd. For a moment, he said nothing. Then slowly he began. "Good afternoon," he said, voice warm and even. "My name is Elijah Monroe. I served in the 2nd Infantry Division during the Korean War." A hush spread across the auditorium. He didn't need to shout. The gravity of his presence filled the space more than volume ever could. "I was 18 when I first saw snow in a country whose name I couldn't pronounce. I had never been that far from Georgia before. Never held a rifle with frostbite in my fingers. Never buried a friend in a land I'd never call home." He paused, letting the words settle. "I came back to the States in '53. No parade, no handshake. Just a bus ticket south in a country that still asked me to use a different door. A country that saluted the uniform, but flinched at the skin wearing it." A few students shifted in their seats. Miss Carter clasped her hands tightly near the stage edge. "This morning," Elijah continued, "I was invited here to speak to you, but I was stopped, questioned, then handcuffed. Because I wore this jacket, because I was walking, and someone didn't like what they saw." His voice didn't waver, it grew stronger. "But I didn't come here today to talk about pain. I came to talk about strength, about resilience, about the kind of courage it takes to keep standing when the world tells you to sit down." He looked directly at the students in the front row. "You are the next generation. You will write the laws, enforce them, or break them. And maybe one day when someone else is walking alone in silence, you'll be the one who listens before judging. Who asks before assuming? Who stands before others shrinks?" The silence in the room was no longer awkward. It was reverent. "I fought overseas for this country," he said, his voice softening. "But the battle for dignity, sometimes that happens right here, in the places we least expect." When he stepped back, the room erupted in applause. Not the kind that fades quickly, but the kind that rises slowly and stays. Ms. Carter returned to his side, eyes wet with gratitude. "Thank you," she whispered. Elijah simply nodded. He hadn't come for recognition. He had come to be heard. And finally he was. The next morning, the town of Ashbridge was no longer asleep. The local paper, the Ashbridge Gazette, ran the story across its front page. "Veteran detained without cause. FBI intervenes at local police station." A grainy photo of Elijah Monroe standing beneath the flagpole at Ashbridge High was captioned simply, "The soldier who reminded us what dignity looks like." By mid-afternoon, the story had spread beyond the county line. Local news vans were parked outside the police department. National outlets picked up the story. Hashtags like #Justice for Elijah and #Walked While Black began trending. The once quiet town found itself at the center of a conversation it had avoided for decades. At the police department, things moved quickly. Under pressure from both federal oversight and mounting public outcry, Officer Higgins and Officer Reyes were suspended pending investigation. Body cam footage, eyewitness reports, and booking logs painted a damning picture. Elijah Monroe had been detained not because of what he did, but because of what he looked like. Officer Brown, quiet, young, and shaken, was placed on administrative duty. When summoned for internal review, he confessed to feeling uneasy during the arrest, but admitted he didn't know how to say no to them. The department's Internal Affairs Board took note. So did the Department of Justice. That same day, Elijah Monroe received a formal, written apology from the mayor's office. It was well-worded, politically cautious, and printed on thick cream paper. But it was the hand-delivered letter from Ms. Carter's students, filled with signatures, scribbled notes, and words like, "Thank you. You changed how I see the world, and I'll remember what you said forever," that Elijah read 3 times over. He folded that one carefully and tucked it into the inside pocket of his military jacket. 1 week later, a town hall meeting was called at Ashbridge Community Center. The place was packed: residents, students, reporters, even off-duty officers. Some came angry, some ashamed, but most came simply because they knew they couldn't pretend anymore. Elijah sat quietly in the third row until his name was called. When he stood and walked to the podium, the room held its breath. "I didn't want to be a symbol," he began, his voice calm but unmistakably firm. "I didn't ask for this attention. I came here to speak to children about courage and sacrifice, and I was reminded painfully that sometimes the hardest battles aren't fought on foreign soil. They're fought in our backyards." He looked around the room at young faces still learning what justice means, and older ones still struggling with what it costs. "I don't want this department destroyed. I want it rebuilt. I want officers who see beyond fear. I want young men like Officer Brown to find their voice before it's too late. I want the people of Ashbridge to stop whispering when something's wrong and speak up." He paused. "And most of all, I want no other elder, no other veteran, no other citizen to feel like their service means less because of the color of their skin." When he stepped down, the applause was slow, but then it rose. Higher, louder, lasting. In the weeks that followed, Ashbridge began to change. A civilian oversight board was formed. Officers were required to undergo bias training, not once a year, but monthly. A new police chief was appointed from outside the county, someone with a history of community engagement and reform. Elijah returned to his quiet home on the outskirts of Charlotte, but he didn't retreat. He spoke at 2 universities, gave a recorded interview for the Library of Congress's Veterans History Project, and began writing down his memories, both from Korea and from Ashbridge. He wanted to leave more than medals behind. He wanted to leave understanding. One afternoon, Ms. Carter mailed him a small wooden plaque. It read, "To Mr. Elijah Monroe, for showing us that real strength is quiet and justice begins with a walk." He placed it beside his Purple Heart. Lesson learned. Elijah Monroe's story reminds us that injustice doesn't always arrive with sirens. Sometimes it walks quietly in uniform, carrying honor no one bothers to see. His experience in Ashbridge was not just about a wrongful arrest. It was about the unseen weight of silence, the danger of assumptions, and the courage it takes to confront quiet bias with unshakable dignity. Justice isn't loud, it's steady. And change doesn't begin with outrage. It begins when one person decides enough is enough. When Elijah took that quiet walk through town, he wasn't asking to be noticed. But in noticing him, we were asked a deeper question. What do we stand for if we can't recognize the people who stood for us?